Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and this episode features a conversation with solo pianist Nic Gerpe. His album is called the Makrokosmos 50 Project, and this pays tribute to Georg Crumb's Makrokosmos Volume 1 for piano solo. And what Nic has done is he's taken the 12 tracks from Makrokosmos Volume 1, which was written in 1972, and he's found composers to write 12 tracks, each of which is inspired by the Georg Crumb collection. This is an absolutely fascinating project, and it really is a landmark of 20th century piano literature. So Crumb composed Makrokosmos Volume 1 in 1972 for his friend, pianist David Burge, and dedicated it to the composer Bela Bartok. And it's inspired by Bartok's Makrokosmos, by Claude Debussy's Preludes, a bit of Chopin, a bit of Schumann. And then Nic Gerpe, so he plays these 12 pieces, but then he's taken 12 new pieces that are inspired by those 12. It's absolutely fascinating. So this project celebrated the 50th anniversary of Makrokosmos Volume 1, and there are 11 composers as well as Nic himself as the 12th. And they each write a response to one movement from the original. You don't have to know all of that to enjoy this collection of piano pieces, but it does make a fascinating story. I hope you enjoy listening to this conversation that I'm about to have with Nic and enjoy some of the music. Welcome to Harmonious World. So I'm joined by Nic Gerpe, solo pianist. We're going to be talking about the Makrokosmos 50 project, which is based on Georg Crumb's Makrokosmos Volume 1 for piano. And this is a collection of the original and then pieces inspired by those 12 tracks. So I'm really excited to hear what Nic has to say about how that project came about. So welcome, Nic.
Thank you so much for having me on, Hilary.
Tell me about, so you knew David Burge, is that right? Who the original was composed for?
I unfortunately never met David Burge, but I had the fortune of studying Makrokosmos Volume 1 while I was a doctoral student at the University of Southern California with Professor Stuart Gordon, who studied the piece with Burge. So I was kind of getting to know Burge one step removed, so to speak. And Dr. Gordon is, he's a consummate master of this piece. And, one of the reasons that I decided to learn the piece and program it for a doctoral lecture recital was having heard Stuart Gordon play it in one of his faculty recitals when I was an undergrad. So I was really inspired and kind of had that in my mind for several years afterwards.
Do people play all 12 pieces or 12 sort of movements of it, but do people play one bit?
It can be done either as the complete cycle, or it can be done individual movements. I've heard kind of both ways. Sometimes people will program individual movements as part of a larger recital. And I've also seen where people will program both Makrokosmos Volume 1 and Volume 2, which was written the following year in 1973. And Crumb talks about how having the two volumes of Makrokosmos, at least the two solo piano volumes, um, each consisting of 12 movements, is complementary to the two volumes of Debussy's Preludes.
And so then what decided you to take this project that step further by commissioning new pieces?
Well, I've performed this piece quite a bit over the years since my lecture recital. I played it, my debut recital for a piano series in Los Angeles called Piano Spheres. The Crumb was the second half of that recital, and I've played it on a couple of different occasions since then. But I had put the piece away for a few years, and then just a couple of things in my life happened, and started thinking about this music again, and pulled it off of the shelf. This would have been like really early in 2021, and I started playing several of the movements again. And it had always been also floating around in my mind that I'd really like to record Makrokosmos Volume 1. And I'd always kind of struggled with, okay, but if we're going to do an album, what do we record it with? And so I was practicing these pieces in January of 2021, and it kind of occurred to me that, hey, wait a minute, this piece was composed in 1972. 2022 will be the anniversary of, or at least the 50th anniversary of the composition of the work. Wouldn't it be cool to do this idea of having, different composers write response movements to it? And so I took this idea. My wife is a composer, and I just walked over to the other room where she was writing, and I said, hey, does this sound like a cool idea to you? And she goes, do it. So of course there was no turning back after that. And of course she was then the first composer that I commissioned for the project, and it just kind of took off from there. The first composers that I asked to write pieces for me for the project were various close friends of mine. And then because I listened to a lot of new music, I kind of had a list of composers who I might want to have compose for the project, people who I might not have ever worked with or didn't know in the first place. And so I just sent out a lot of messages and told people what I was doing and asked if they wanted to be a part of it. And even the ones who couldn't because of prior commitments were really, really, really enthusiastic about it. And so I think by the time the end of summer of 2021 rolled around, I had my complete roster of composers committed for the project.
So it's actually been a very quick process. I mean, that's, to get all of this completed and recorded and released within 2 years is really extraordinary.
Yeah, it was a very, very, very quick timeline, to be sure.
Yeah.
I was just, very, very fortunate that I had such an amazing group of people wanting to compose music for this, and then also that honestly the reception from various venues and series who I proposed it to, people were really enthusiastic. Like all of them just thought, wow, what a great idea. And so I was very fortunate also to be able to program it and tour with it in several different places. And the recording process, we did it in 2 days. The studio recording, we did Crumb on one day, and then the 12 new pieces the next day, and that was that.
Wow. I mean, that's extraordinary, Nic, because these are very complex pieces.
Yeah, some of the new pieces particularly are really pretty tricky. It was a lot of practice time, but
Right.
they're all such great music. It's just an absolute pleasure to work on it. Just at a certain point, it doesn't feel like work because it's just fun to put this all together, and
Yeah.
everything just felt so good to play.
Yeah. Tell me about the composition, because you composed Ghost of the Manticore, which is based on the Phantom Gondolier. How did you take the Phantom Gondolier and turn it into the Ghost of the Manticore?
So, one of my favorite artists, I would say growing up, but still to this day, is Keith Emerson from Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Right.
And the one of the many extra musical associations in Crumb's Makrokosmos is that every movement is dedicated to a different friend or colleague or family member or musical inspiration born under a particular zodiac sign. So for instance, in Makrokosmos Volume 1, the 10th movement, the Aries movement, is dedicated to David Burge. And so, you see the Aries symbol at the end of the movement, as well as DRB, the initials for David Burge. And then the 5th movement, the Phantom Gondolier, the Scorpio movement, Crumb dedicates to himself, at least in the first volume. So you see the GHC at the end. And I had this recollection that, wait a minute, Keith Emerson was a Scorpio too. And wouldn't it be kind of a fun thing to compose a piece that is, I guess for lack of a better description, a musical conversation between George Crumb and Keith Emerson? So much of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, one of the amazing things, of course, their original compositions are phenomenal, but their transcriptions of lots of great classical, especially 20th century composers, are really, really remarkable. I mean, honestly, when I was a kid, my first exposure to the music of Bartók and Copland and Ginastera was, and Janacek also, was not through listening to the original music, but actually through Keith Emerson's kind of electrified transcriptions of all of this. And then I got very curious and thought, whoa, who are these guys? And went and listened to the originals and thought, wow, okay, that's the kind of music I want to be playing. And so anyway, this movement, the Ghost of the Manticore, really ended up being for me a tribute to these two great musical Scorpios who were such influences on me, and as well thinking, what would it be like if the two of them were having some kind of a musical dialogue? So, there's bits of Crumb's harmonic language, and the piece is very, kind of a virtuosic toccata sort of thing, a la Keith Emerson.
So here we have an extract from Ghost of the Manticore by Nic Gerpe. Right. It is an extraordinary piece of music. And that's one of the things that I like about the 12 new pieces, is that they all stand alone as interesting pieces of music.
Right.
The link to the original is great, which is an intellectual thing, I guess, but actually they stand alone, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think any of these pieces can be played by itself out of the context of the entire cycle and work just fine on its own. But one of the interesting things too in putting the project together, when I asked the different composers to write movements for me, I didn't assign movements to anybody. I just said, listen to the original Crumb and give me maybe 2 or 3 of your favorite movements, and 2 or 3 just in case there was some conflict between people as far as wanting one specific movement. Fortunately, there wasn't any. Everybody just kind of picked, and it sort of worked out. Of course, people were getting back to me at various times, so I could say, well, movement 4 is already taken, for example.
Right.
But at any rate, I was getting the movements from people in dribs and drabs and completely out of order. Like it wasn't like I got anything sequentially. And I think that the first movement I got that was completed was Eric Ginnivan's movement, the 4th movement, the symbol movement. And then my wife, Juhi Bansal, gave me her movement second. And then I think Vera Ivanova gave me her movement, which is the first one, Karkata. And anyway, so it's completely out of order. And I remember at one point, one of the composers had said, if you're not assigning movements to people, and also I told them not to communicate with one another as far as trying to write movements that were complementary of each other. And one of the composers said, you might run into issues with continuity in that case. And, it was definitely a concern, but, I thought I kind of wanted everybody just to respond to their individual movements in the most natural and organic way possible. And what was really cool is that as I started getting all of these movements and the puzzle pieces started filling themselves in, I was thinking, wow, there's really a nice arc to this new set too. And then playing it beginning to end, finally, when all of the pieces were in, and it was really, really remarkable to me actually how well the whole new cycle works from top to bottom. So it was just a really interesting, I guess, an interesting result that those pieces all work individually, but also in an arc.
Yeah. Yes. So performing them live, have you done much of that?
So I will perform the original Crumb in its entirety as the first half of a concert, then take a little intermission, and then do the new cycle as the second half of a concert. And that's worked really well. People seem to really enjoy that structure and that pacing. And I had thought at one point to experiment with doing one movement of Crumb and one of the new pieces.
Yeah, the pairings. Yeah,
pairings. But the thing to me is that the Crumb itself is such a tight compositional arc from beginning to end that I always feel kind of loath to break it up.
Right. I get that completely. Yeah. Because it's interesting listening to them in order, if you like. It does all make sense, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that piece of Makrokosmos 1 is so tightly composed. There's so much that links the movements together structurally and harmonically, and then there are plenty of little thematic things that come back in various guises. The piece uses the compositional technique that we call cyclicism, which means that musical ideas and motives that are found in an earlier movement come back later on in the work. And so there are just all of these threads throughout the piece that really hold it together. And one of the things I really find remarkable about a piece like Makrokosmos is that because of how tightly composed it is, the piece, in performance lasts anywhere between 33 and 36 minutes, really depending on how much time you take in between the three big sections. But it doesn't feel like a half hour. It feels like it just flies by.
Where can people hear you playing it? So people can buy the album, obviously. And where will you be performing it live next?
Well, I don't have any dates scheduled just yet. I'm still trying to work out a couple of dates for the East Coast and then possibly a couple for Europe. But the new concert dates will appear on the project website, which is just makrokosmos50.com. And then if people want to check out the audio version of the album, it's on Spotify and iTunes and Amazon Music, as well as Bandcamp. And then there's the video version of the album, which I've put on my artist channel on YouTube that people can check out and see.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Well, I'll put links to all of that on the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, Nic. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me on, Hillary.
Thank you for joining me once more for Harmonious World, and I hope you enjoyed listening to my conversation with Nic Gerpe. You can check out Makrokosmos 50 in the show notes. What you're listening to now is Dewey Bansal's Through Cracked Mirrors. Thank you for joining me once more on Harmonious World, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hillary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.